The North Atlantic, 1941. The water is black as oil, churned by storms that never seem to end. Somewhere beneath those waves, a German U-boat is stalking a convoy of merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and ammunition to a besieged Britain. The submarine commander peers through his periscope, calculating angles, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He's done this dozens of times before. He knows these waters belong to him. On the deck of a Canadian corvette, a young sailor stands beside a strange contraption that looks like it was cobbled together in someone's garage. It's a squat metal frame holding 24 projectiles, each one looking more like a trash can than a weapon of war. The British Admiralty called it primitive, outdated, a waste of resources. They actually laughed when they first saw it. But in the next 6 minutes, this ridiculous-looking device is going to change everything. This is the story of the Hedgehog, the weapon that nobody wanted, that everyone dismissed, and that ended up becoming one of the most lethal subkillers in naval history. It's a story about innovation born from desperation, about underdogs proving the experts wrong, and about how sometimes the simplest solution is the one that saves lives. Let's go back to where it all began. By 1940, Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic, and they were losing badly. German U-boats were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. Every week, dozens of vessels went to the bottom, taking their crews and desperately needed supplies with them. The math was simple and terrifying. If the U-boats kept up this pace, Britain would be starved into surrender within a year. The problem wasn't that the Allies didn't have anti-submarine weapons. They did. The depth charge had been around since World War I, a barrel-shaped explosive that you rolled off the back of your ship and hoped it would sink down to where the submarine was hiding. When it reached the right depth, it would detonate, and if you were lucky and the sub was close enough, the pressure wave would crush its hull like a beer can. But here's the thing about depth charges. They were almost comically ineffective. Think about what you're trying to do. You're on the surface of the ocean trying to hit a target you can't see, that's moving in 3 dimensions, in water that distorts sound and makes tracking nearly impossible. You detect a submarine with sonar, you plot its course, you steam over to where you think it is, and then you roll these charges off your stern, hoping they'll sink down to the right depth at the right time and explode close enough to do damage. The statistics were brutal. On average, it took over 200 depth charges to sink a single U-boat. 200. And each attack run meant you had to sail directly over the submarine, which meant you lost sonar contact for the crucial final moments of your approach. The sub would hear you coming, the commander would make one quick maneuver, and by the time your depth charges exploded, he'd be 200 yards away laughing at you. It gets worse. Because you had to pass directly over the target, you were setting off massive explosions right behind your own ship. The shock waves would damage your hull, shake your equipment loose, give your crew concussions. Sailors called it, getting your own bell rung. And for what? A 1 in 200 chance of actually hitting anything? The U-boats, meanwhile, were getting better. Faster. More lethal. German submariners called this period, the happy time. They would surface at night, attack with impunity, and slip away before dawn. British and Canadian convoy escorts were outmatched, outgunned, and watching good men die because their weapons didn't work. Something had to change. Enter Lieutenant Commander Charles Gedive, a Canadian scientist who looked more like a university professor than a military man, probably because that's exactly what he was. Gedive had been teaching chemistry when the war broke out, and suddenly found himself in the British Admiralty, trying to solve problems that were getting thousands of people killed. Gedive was brilliant, but more importantly, he was practical. He didn't care about elegant solutions or complicated technology. He cared about what worked. And when he looked at the depth charge problem, he saw something that everyone else had missed. The problem wasn't the explosive. The problem was the delivery system. Think about it this way. If you're trying to kill a mosquito, you don't wait for it to fly past you and then swing your hand behind your back hoping to hit it. You swat forward where you can see it. The depth charge system was like trying to kill that mosquito by swinging backward while blindfolded. What if, Gedive thought, instead of dropping explosives behind the ship, we fired them forward? What if we could maintain sonar contact right up until the moment of attack? What if we could blanket an area ahead of the ship with multiple projectiles, creating a pattern of explosions that would be impossible to escape? The idea was simple. Almost too simple. Which is probably why nobody had thought of it before. Gedive brought the concept to his team at the Admiralty's Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. Yes, that was the real name. The department where they stuck all the weird ideas that didn't fit anywhere else. It was basically the island of misfit toys but for weapons. And it was about to create something that would help win the war. The team started sketching designs. The weapon would fire multiple projectiles forward in a circular pattern. Each projectile would be a small bomb with a contact fuse, meaning it would only explode if it actually hit something. No more wasting explosives on empty ocean. And because they were smaller than depth charges, you could carry more of them. They called it the hedgehog because when you looked at it from above, the pattern of projectiles looked like the spines on a hedgehog's back. It wasn't a glamorous name. It wasn't intimidating. It was kinda cute, actually. Which should have been the first sign that the traditionalists at the Admiralty were going to hate it. The first prototype was built in 1941, and it was as ungainly as you'd expect from a rush job during wartime. It was a steel cradle that held 24 projectiles, each one about 2 feet long and weighing 65 pounds. The projectiles were fin-stabilized, which is a fancy way of saying they had little fins that would make them fly straight. The whole thing was mounted on the foredeck, and it used a spigot mortar system to launch the bombs. Here's where it gets interesting. A spigot mortar is this weird invention where instead of putting the explosive charge inside the projectile, you put it on a central rod or spigot. The projectile fits over the spigot, and when you fire it, the explosive charge launches the projectile off the rod. It's mechanically simple, which means it's reliable. And reliability, in the middle of the North Atlantic in a force 8 gale, is everything. The first tests were conducted off the coast of Scotland, and the results were promising. The Hedgehog could fire its 24 projectiles in a circular pattern about 40 yards across, at a range of about 200 yards ahead of the ship. The projectiles would sink at a predictable rate, and if one hit a submarine's hull, the impact fuse would detonate 35 pounds of torpex, an explosive significantly more powerful than TNT. But promising test results and actual combat effectiveness are two very different things. And that's where the skepticism came in. When the Admiralty brass saw the Hedgehog, they didn't see a revolutionary weapon. They saw a contraption that looked like it had been assembled by a somewhat clever plumber. It was ungainly. It was unusual. It didn't fit any existing naval doctrine. And most damning of all, it was being championed by a Canadian scientist, not a proper Royal Navy admiral. The British naval establishment in 1941 was one of the most tradition-bound institutions on earth. These were men who believed that the Royal Navy's way of doing things was the right way because it had been the right way since Nelson was kicking Napoleon's ass at Trafalgar. They didn't want innovation. They wanted bigger, better depth charges. It looks like something you'd find in a scrapyard, one admiral reportedly said. Another called it, a poor man's weapon for a poor man's navy. The implication was clear. This might be good enough for the Canadians who were newcomers to anti-submarine warfare, but the Royal Navy deserved better. There was also a fundamental bias at play. The depth charge was a weapon of attrition. You dropped lots of them, you kept the submarine down, you prevented it from attacking, and eventually, over many engagements, you'd sink it. This was the naval equivalent of artillery bombardment. Overwhelming force applied persistently. It was what big, powerful navies did. The Hedgehog, by contrast, was a weapon of precision. You got one shot. If you hit, the submarine died. If you missed, nothing exploded and you got no feedback. No massive waterspouts to make you feel like you were doing something. Just silence. For sailors who were used to the thunderous reassurance of depth charges, this was psychologically unsatisfying. How do we know it's even working if nothing explodes? Was a common complaint. The answer, of course, was that if the Hedgehog exploded, you knew it worked because you just hit a submarine. But this required a completely different mindset. It required trusting your equipment and accepting that sometimes the best sign that you've missed is the absence of an explosion. The British Admiralty dragged their feet on implementation. They authorized a few Hedgehogs to be installed on some ships, mostly to placate the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development and shut them up. But there was no enthusiasm, no aggressive deployment. The weapon that could change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic was gathering dust because it didn't look impressive enough. The Canadians, meanwhile, had a different perspective. The Royal Canadian Navy in 1941 was expanding at an absolutely insane rate. At the start of the war, Canada had exactly 6 destroyers. By 1943, they'd have over 400 warships and would be responsible for escorting nearly half of all Allied convoys. They were building corvettes as fast as they could hammer them together, crewing them with merchant sailors and fishermen who'd never been in combat, and sending them out to face the most sophisticated submarine force in the world. The Canadians didn't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect weapon. They needed something that worked and they needed it now. When the Hedgehog became available, Canadian Naval Command said yes immediately. If the British wanted to sneer at it, fine. More for us. The first Canadian ship equipped with a Hedgehog was HMCS Oakville, a Flower-class corvette that looked like someone had tried to build a warship out of a fishing trawler and mostly succeeded. In August 1942, Oakville was escorting a convoy in the Caribbean when she detected a submerged contact. The captain ordered the Hedgehog armed. The crew, most of whom had never used the weapon in combat, loaded the projectiles and aimed based on the sonar contact. At 200 yards they fired. 24 projectiles arced through the air and splashed into the Caribbean Sea in a perfect circular pattern. They sank. Seconds passed. Then 2 explosions erupted beneath the surface. The submarine U-94 was mortally wounded. It tried to surface to escape, but Oakville was already there, ramming it, firing machine guns, even boarding it in an action that would become legendary in Canadian naval history. The Hedgehog had just scored its first kill. But Oakville didn't just use the weapon, they proved that it worked exactly as designed. 2 hits out of 24 projectiles and the submarine was done. Word spread. Other Canadian ships started reporting successes. HMCS Chambly. HMCS Morden. HMCS Swansea. Every time a Hedgehog-equipped ship engaged a submarine, the odds were suddenly in the escort's favor. The weapon that the British had mocked was racking up kills at a rate that traditional depth charges couldn't match. Here's why it worked so well. First, maintaining sonar contact. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary then. By firing forward instead of dropping charges behind, operators could track the submarine right up to the moment of attack. If the sub maneuvered, they knew immediately and could adjust. Second, the circular pattern. Instead of trying to guess exactly where the submarine was and hoping one depth charge would be close enough, the Hedgehog created a zone of death. If the submarine was anywhere in that 40-yard circle, it was in serious trouble. The math suddenly favored the escorts. Third, the contact fuse. This was genius. Because the projectiles only exploded on impact, there was no wasted ordnance. Every explosion meant a hit. And for the submarine crew, this was psychologically devastating. They'd gotten used to depth charges, which gave them warning. They'd hear the splashes, count the seconds, brace for the explosions. With the Hedgehog, they'd hear the splashes, and then either nothing happened or their hull was being ripped open. No warning. No time to react. The statistics started to tell the story. Ships equipped with Hedgehogs were sinking U-boats at 3 times the rate of ships using only depth charges. By 1943, the Royal Navy's skepticism was starting to crack. You couldn't argue with numbers like that. But the real turning point came with a ship called HMS Lagan, a river-class frigate operating in the Atlantic. In March 1944, Lagan detected a submarine contact in rough seas, conditions that made traditional depth charge attacks nearly impossible. The captain ordered a Hedgehog attack. The first pattern missed. Silence. The sub was still there. The crew reloaded, adjusted aim, and fired again. 2 explosions. The submarine U-653 went to the bottom with all hands. What made this engagement significant was that British naval officers were on board observing. They saw firsthand how the weapon operated, how the crew used it, and most importantly, how effective it was. The report they filed back to the Admiralty was glowing. Finally, the old guard started to listen. By mid-1944, Hedgehog production was ramped up dramatically. British shipyards were installing them on escorts as fast as they could. The weapon that had been dismissed as primitive and outdated 2 years earlier was now in high demand. The Germans noticed. U-boat commanders started reporting a new type of attack, one that gave them no warning and no chance to evade. Their survival rates plummeted. Boats that went out on patrol weren't coming back. The happy time was over. One German submarine captain who survived the war later described a Hedgehog attack. It was like being in a steel coffin while someone threw rocks at you in the dark. You couldn't hear them coming. You couldn't dodge. You just waited and hoped none of them hit. And then one did, and it was over. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was immense. These were men who had dominated the Atlantic for years, who had sent hundreds of ships to the bottom. Now they were prey. Morale in the U-boat fleet collapsed. Experienced commanders started finding reasons not to go on patrol. New crews were terrified before they even left port. By the end of 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively won. The U-boats were still out there, still dangerous, but they were no longer the existential threat they had been. Convoys were getting through. Britain was being fed and armed. And a major reason for that shift was a weapon that had been laughed at by the very people it was designed to help. The final numbers are staggering. The Hedgehog was credited with sinking 47 German submarines and 14 Italian submarines for a total of 61 confirmed kills. But those numbers don't tell the whole story. The weapon's real impact was in attacks that damaged submarines, forcing them to return to port for repairs, keeping them out of action. It was in the psychological pressure that made U-boat crews less aggressive, less willing to press an attack. It was in the simple fact that convoy escorts could now fight back effectively. For context, those 47 German U-boats each would have sunk an average of 5 to 10 Allied ships over their operational lifespan. That's between 235 and 470 merchant vessels that stayed afloat because the Hedgehog existed. Thousands of sailors who went home to their families. Millions of tons of supplies that reached their destination. And here's something that often gets overlooked. The Hedgehog was also significantly safer for the attacking ship. Depth charge attacks meant sailing directly over a submarine that might be damaged and desperate, that might try to surface and ram you or fire torpedoes at point-blank range. Depth charges also damaged your own ship with their shock waves. The Hedgehog eliminated both problems. You attacked from a distance and your ship suffered no damage from your own weapons. Crew survival rates on Hedgehog-equipped ships were measurably higher than on ships with only depth charges. This wasn't just a more effective weapon, it was a safer weapon for the men using it. After the war, when military analysts sat down to figure out what had worked and what hadn't, the Hedgehog was near the top of the what worked list. It became standard equipment on anti-submarine vessels and navies around the world. The Americans developed their own version. The Soviets copied it. Everyone wanted one. The British Admiralty, to their credit, eventually admitted they'd been wrong. In a post-war assessment, one report noted, the Hedgehog represented a fundamental shift in anti-submarine warfare doctrine, one that was initially resisted due to institutional conservatism but ultimately proved decisive in the Atlantic campaign. That's military speak for, we were idiots and thank God someone ignored us. But what makes this story truly fascinating isn't just that an underestimated weapon proved effective. It's what the Hedgehog represents about innovation, about how good ideas get adopted, and about the danger of dismissing something just because it doesn't fit your preconceptions. Charles Gedive, the Canadian scientist who championed the weapon, wasn't a naval officer. He didn't rise through the ranks. He didn't have decades of experience in naval warfare. What he had was a fresh perspective and a willingness to question fundamental assumptions. The assumption everyone else had made was that anti-submarine weapons needed to be powerful and numerous. Bigger depth charges. More of them. Overwhelm the target with explosive force. Gedive asked a different question. What if we made the weapon smarter instead of bigger? This is a pattern you see over and over in innovation. The experts, the people who know the most about a field, are often the ones most resistant to revolutionary change. They're invested in the current system. They've built their careers on it. They can tell you exactly why your new idea won't work, and they'll have 500 years of tradition to back them up. But sometimes, the person who knows just enough to understand the problem, but not so much that they're trapped by conventional thinking, is the one who finds the solution. The Hedgehog also illustrates something crucial about military effectiveness. Fancy doesn't mean better. The Hedgehog wasn't sophisticated. It was a bunch of bombs on a rack, launched by what was essentially a giant slingshot. There was no radar guidance, no computer targeting, no advanced electronics. It was simple, mechanical, and robust. And that simplicity was its strength. It could be manufactured quickly and cheaply. It could be maintained by regular sailors without specialized training. It worked in the worst weather conditions when sophisticated systems would fail. It was, in the best sense of the word, a practical weapon. The U-boats, by contrast, were marvels of engineering. Sophisticated, complex, expensive machines that required years of training to operate effectively. And they were being sunk by what amounted to a very clever pile driver. There's a lesson there about the difference between impressive technology and effective technology. The human element of this story is worth dwelling on too. Think about those Canadian corvette crews. Most of them were civilians 6 months before they found themselves in the North Atlantic hunting submarines. They were fishermen from Newfoundland, farm boys from Saskatchewan, mechanics from Toronto. They'd been handed a crash course in naval warfare and sent out to face one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. And they were being asked to use a weapon that their own officers weren't sure about, that the British said was junk, that looked like it had been built in someone's shed. They had every reason to doubt it. But they trusted it anyway. They learned how to use it, they practiced with it, and when the moment came they fired it with confidence. And they won. That kind of courage, the courage to trust in something new when everything is on the line, that's what actually wins wars. Not the weapons themselves but the people willing to use them effectively. There's also something poignant about how quickly the Hedgehog faded from public memory. If you ask people today to name famous weapons from World War II, they'll say Spitfire, Sherman tank, maybe the Norden bomb sight. Nobody says Hedgehog. It's been forgotten outside of naval history circles. Maybe that's because it wasn't glamorous. It didn't make for good propaganda footage. There's no exciting film of a hedgehog attack because most of what happened occurred underwater, invisible to cameras. The weapon did its job quietly, efficiently, and then was retired when the war ended. But the men who served on those corvettes, who escorted those convoys, who came home because the hedgehog kept the submarines away, they remembered. In Royal Canadian Navy reunions for decades after the war, veterans would talk about their hedgehog, with a mixture of affection and respect usually reserved for old friends. One veteran, interviewed in the 1990s, put it simply, "That ugly little contraption saved my life more times than I can count." The British could laugh all they wanted. We knew what it was worth. The story of the hedgehog is ultimately a story about vindication. About being right when everyone says you're wrong. About simple solutions to complex problems. About the importance of keeping an open mind, even when you're an expert, especially when you're an expert. It's also a reminder that the history we remember isn't always the history that mattered most. We remember the big battles, the famous generals, the dramatic turning points. We forget the unglamorous weapons that quietly shifted the balance, the civilian scientists who solved problems the military couldn't, the young sailors who trusted their equipment and did their jobs. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by thousands of small victories, by incremental improvements, by weapons like the hedgehog that weren't dramatic but were devastatingly effective. Every convoy that got through meant Britain stayed in the war. Every U-boat that didn't come home meant fewer Allied ships at the bottom of the ocean. And yes, the British eventually came around. By 1945, the Royal Navy had more hedgehogs in service than the Canadians did. They'd gone from laughing at it to making it a standard weapon on every escort vessel. The admirals who'd called it primitive were now writing reports about how essential it was to anti-submarine operations. Nobody apologized to Charles Gedive, of course. That's not how institutions work. But he got something better than an apology. He got to be right. He got to see his weapon save thousands of lives. And he got the quiet satisfaction of watching the people who dismissed him rush to copy what he'd created. After the war, Gedive returned to Canada and continued his scientific career. He never sought credit or fame for the hedgehog. In interviews, he'd deflect praise and talk about the team effort, about all the people who'd contributed. He was a scientist, not a glory seeker. But the Royal Canadian Navy didn't forget. Neither did the sailors whose lives had been saved. And neither should we. Because this story, this forgotten chapter of World War II, encapsulates something fundamental about how progress happens. It's not always the biggest army or the most advanced technology that wins. Sometimes it's the simplest idea, implemented by people willing to trust it, defended by someone stubborn enough to keep pushing when everyone else says stop. The hedgehog sank 47 U-boats. It damaged dozens more. It helped turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. It saved thousands of lives. And it started with a Canadian scientist asking a simple question. What if we fired forward instead of backward? Sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to question the assumption everyone else accepts. One simple idea that solves a complex problem. One unglamorous weapon that wins a war. The British laughed at Canada's outdated torpedo. Then it sank 20 enemy ships. Then 30. Then 40. And by the time they stopped laughing and started paying attention, the weapon they'd mocked had already changed the course of history. That's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you the freedom to prove everyone wrong. And when you do, when your supposedly primitive weapon starts racking up victories, when the numbers become impossible to ignore, when even the skeptics have to admit you were right all along, that vindication is sweeter than any praise could ever be. The hedgehog wasn't just a weapon. It was proof that innovation can come from anywhere, that expertise isn't the same as wisdom, and that sometimes the best solution is the one everyone else overlooked. It was proof that the underdogs can win. That the colonials could teach the empire a thing or two. That a scientist could outsmart the admirals. That simple could beat sophisticated. And most importantly, it was proof that when lives are on the line, what matters isn't how impressive your weapon looks or how much tradition backs it up. What matters is whether it works. The hedgehog worked. Boy, did it work. And somewhere, in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, there are 47 German submarines that can attest to that.